This is Unit 2, Lesson 3. We'll be talking about angles and triangles. So in this lesson, we'll learn about the triangle-angle-sum theorem and use properties of isosceles triangles to find missing angles. This video will relate specifically to the vocabulary that you need for the lesson and for the unit. Related terms, which we're not going to discuss below because we've already discussed it, is equilateral triangle, but you may see this in practice problems and you need to know how to use that information. So please grab that vocabulary card as well. So for the terms below, please make an index card so that you can reference them. So the first thing is the triangle-angle-sum theorem. This states that the interior angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees. Right, so interior means the inside angles. Right, so for example, P, Q, and R would sum to 180. Or here's an example here with values. 70 degrees plus 50 degrees plus 60 degrees equals 180. So it's extremely important to remember this. This is used over and over again. So the angles in a triangle sum to 180 degrees. The second term, which again will be the focus of the lesson, is the isosceles triangle. This triangle has a lot of other vocabulary that's associated with it. So let's take a look at that. So an isosceles triangle is a triangle with at least two congruent legs and two congruent angles. The reason we say at least is because an equilateral triangle is considered an isosceles triangle because it has the same properties. Right? So the congruent sides are opposite the congruent angles, and vice versa. If we know the two congruent angles, we know which two sides are congruent. If we know the congruent sides, we know which two angles are congruent. We call the congruent angles the base angles because they lie along the base. Here's the base. So that's a base angle, and that's a base angle. Okay, the base is the non-congruent side of the isosceles triangle. So we have one congruent side here, one congruent side here, and they meet at the base, which is not congruent to those. Okay, those are the congruent legs. We call sides of a triangle legs. The angle that is not congruent to the other two is the vertex angle. So that angle is up here. Again, if it's an equilateral, it could be congruent to the other two, but that is the only case where that would be true. If we draw an altitude on an isosceles triangle, then that altitude, also called the height, divides the triangle into two congruent right triangles, right? So that altitude is the perpendicular bisector of the base, and it is also the angle bisector of the vertex angle. Right? Because again, note that this angle and this angle are congruent to one another. We also know that the base angles are congruent to one another. Right, so the isosceles triangle has a lot of properties associated with it that we will be using throughout the year and in this unit. However, the most important right now is that it has two congruent legs, two congruent angles, and the congruent angles are opposite the congruent sides. The congruent sides are opposite the congruent angles. Other types of triangles that will come up in the unit. We'll talk more about right triangles later in the year. However, a right triangle is a triangle with one right angle. It will not be a triangle if it has two because their sum has to be 180. The longest side of the right triangle is called the hypotenuse, and it is opposite or across from the 90-degree angle. Right? The non-right angles, so in this case A and B, are complementary, meaning they must sum to 90. If all the angles have to add to 180, we already have a 90-degree angle here, then the other two must add to 90. Additionally, a review from 8th grade, the sides must satisfy Pythagorean theorem. So if we square one leg, add it to the square of the other leg, we get the hypotenuse squared. Again, that will come up much later. We're going to do that in another unit. But I thought I'd add that to the card for now. Some other review terms about triangles that we're going to refresh. A scalene triangle is a triangle with no congruent angles, meaning none of the sides are congruent either. Right? The angles correspond to the side lengths. So if it has congruent sides, it's going to have congruent angles across from those sides. An acute triangle is a triangle where all the angles are less than 90, or acute. Remember, oh, it's so cute. Usually we talk about things that are tiny. So all the angles are tiny, or in this case, less than 90. And the other type of triangle is an obtuse triangle, which would have one obtuse angle, which is one angle that is larger than 90 degrees. Obtuse angle means it measures greater than 90. So let's get to the lesson piece. So that will be in the next video.